Hello and welcome to Literary Prospects. I'm Kelley Vick, your host, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest. Danilyn Rutherford is the president of the Wintergrim Foundation for Anthropological Research. An award-winning anthropologist, she's taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the University of Chicago, and she's authored several books. Her latest book, Beautiful Mystery: Living in a Wordless World, is an academic memoir about life with her multiply disabled daughter, Millie, and it's out now. Danilyn lives in Santa Cruz, California. Danilyn Rutherford, thank you so much for being here today to talk about your gorgeous new book, Beautiful Mystery: Living in a Wordless World. Author Faye Ginsberg says, Danilyn Rutherford has given us a riveting and powerful chronicle. Her writing is luminous, moving, and deeply thoughtful. She carries us along on her path to knowledge gained over many years as she learns the most essential life lessons from living with her disabled daughter, Millie. What it means to be human in ways that embrace the vast diversity and beautiful mystery of the body-minds we are privileged to encounter. And author T.M. Lerman says, Beautiful Mystery is that rare and precious book, both an unforgettable personal story and a powerfully argued view of how to think about profound human difference, beautifully written and deeply moving. So, Danilyn, welcome. Thank you
Oh,
so much for being here.
thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. Yeah.
What can you tell us about Beautiful Mystery? How do you describe this book?
So this book is kind of three stories at once, and it's two of those stories are actually written just for someone I used to be, for the anthropologist I used to be when I was 40, for the mother I was when I was 40. But then it's also written for people who just have no idea of what the life of people like my daughter and their care providers are like. So the anthropological story is basically about an anthropologist, who has a daughter who leads her to call into question what she's been taught about what it means to be human. Now, anthropology literally means the study of people, and
Mhm.
it comes with all sorts of assumptions about what makes us human. I mean, we're probably the least universalizing, of disciplines, but then at the same time, just built into our methods. We interview people, we watch them, we listen to them talk, right? You
Mhm.
know, even just our ethics, we do informed consent. There are all sorts of ways a certain notion of a person is kind of built into that. And it's like language, bipedalism, tool use, complex reasoning. Take your pick.
Mhm.
Most people walk around with the idea that you have to pass a certain litmus test if you're going to count as a person, right? You have to
Mhm.
walk, talk, and engage with people in certain ways. And I think we're not conscious of it. We would deny it. But all of these things become glaringly obvious. If you're like an anthropologist, like I was when I was going through this, was I was teaching high theory to doctoral students at the same time as I was, had this daughter who was calling a lot of the things we were saying into question. So it's that book. It's also a personal story. It's, a daughter turns out to be severely disabled, a beloved husband drops dead, and everyone lives happily ever after. I mean, this is kind of the classic memoir. I lived through some really tough things and I survived. And in my case, it's funny, some of the people in the book, Millie's caregivers, are now reading it. And one of them texted me and said, if I've ever said or done anything mean to you, I apologize. I had no idea you went through all this, which I thought was incredibly funny. But yeah, I lost my husband when my kids were 3 and 6. We had been together for a very long time. We met in college. He was 20, I was 21. At the time, we were already living what a lot of people think of as a nightmare, having a kid who's just not doing any of the expected things, not hitting any of the milestones. And it's just really clear that this kid is going to be really severely disabled. So people were looking upon us with pity, right? And then
Mhm.
suddenly, for me, the worst thing that could possibly have happened happened. He died very suddenly of a heart attack. He was 41, I was 42. I was 2 weeks away from learning whether I'd get tenure at the University of Chicago, something I'd worked for very hard. And basically, I'll never get over it. It changed
Mhm.
me forever. I'm a different person now than I was then. There are some similarities, but my whole kind of stance on life really changed. But that's not really the point of the story. There are so
Mhm.
many great stories like that written by really talented writers, and it's often understandably, it's quite individualistic, right? It's the story of me. Whereas I really wanted this story to end up being the story of us. And, there's an irony there. This thing in my life that was supposed to be so tragic, having
Mhm.
this multiply disabled person in my life, in some ways it kind of saved me, and if I'm living the happily ever after, it's in part due to Millie. It's
Mhm.
due to good luck, it's due to privilege, it's due to all sorts of things that have shaped my life. But Millie and the worlds that she's brought me into and the world she's created around us is just a really important part of that. And I think that's also a lesson for our society. And that's kind of what the third story is, which is a political story. And it was funny when I was writing this book, I'm going to say, like, historically, Millie was someone who wouldn't really count as a person. I felt like, okay, making those comparisons was kind of extreme. Like
Mhm.
this whole question, who gets to get recognized as a person or who does not?
Mhm.
Because we're living in a moment, at least in California where we live, where brave disability activists, disabled justice warriors have created a world in which the services are not so bad, right? But
Mhm.
then you look at what's happening at the federal level with $1 trillion cut to Medicaid, and this question of who gets to be recognized as a person and who does not no longer seems so rhetorical, And
Mhm.
in my book, I kind of start with like parents, like how do parents who are raised in a society that has certain expectations about who gets to count and who doesn't, you have a kid who's not passing those litmus tests, how do you deal with it? And, a book I really love that deals with this problem is Andrew Solomon's Far from the Tree. And he has a quote where he says, loving your children is an act of the imagination. We have this tendency to want our children to be just like us, right? And
Mhm.
it's totally been part of me. It's like my son Ralph should go to college, enjoy the crew team, and maybe become a professor, to
Mhm.
basically be like his mom. Millie should work in a bookstore because I can happily imagine myself working in a bookstore. You have
Mhm.
these stories that tell you the story of the rest of your life and your kid's life, and they have to be kind of recognizable. And, I think we need to get beyond that, right? There's a way in which whatever. I feel like I'm going on and on, but I feel really
It's
passionate about
wonderful.
these things. I do. There's a way in which, the way disabled people get treated in the best of cases, it's like Millie does all of these things that put her in typical situations. She has a
Mhm.
volunteer job, she goes to dances, and that's all wonderful. That totally enriches her social relationships, and she's a force within all of those scenes. But it is kind of like this defensive posture in a way. Like our kids have to be presented as, in some sense, typical or normal, because historically, not being normal can be lethal, right? If you
Mhm.
look back at, whatever, no one, it's always problematic and dangerous to trot out the Nazis, but there are ways in which the justifications of the euthanasia killings are not that different from the way that we're thinking about the expensiveness of Medicaid today.
Mhm.
When you have a president, and this is a quote, who knows, but it's in his nephew's memoir, once said about his nephew's multiply disabled son, the shape they're in, all the expenses, maybe these kinds of people should just die. That sort of notion that people with the level of, high support needs that my daughter has have really unhappy lives and they're super expensive and let's just give up. I mean, that's something that I think really remains within our society.
Mhm.
And it has to do with we haven't been exercising the muscle of trying to imagine what it would be like to live a life really different from ours. So that's, if there's a political mission in the book, I think that's it. And it's not just about Millie, it's about her care providers too. And that was really important to me. So sorry, long answer, but
I love a long answer. Danilyn, it's
yeah,
great. I love a long answer. Um, well, I think you've sort of touched on it maybe with talking about current politics, but
yeah.
was there a certain spark that told you, I need to write this story now? Millie's in her mid-20s now.
Oh,
Why
that's
this time?
I would love that if that was the case. Timing is always just a matter of luck. I've published three academic books, and they're all about a topic and a group of people I care deeply about, people who live in the westernmost half of New Guinea, which
Mhm.
is an occupied part of Indonesia. And I've been writing about that forever. And it's like, if I sell like 100 books, I'm like, we're happy, right? It's really an accident that this is kind of in the news in the way it is. And I sort of regret the reasons why, I have to say.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, the spark for writing this book actually came when she was tiny and I was in early intervention. I mentioned I was teaching
Mhm.
I was teaching doctoral students and, I like, was a reluctant mother. It's like, okay, I have to find the manual on this. And so the what to expect when you're expecting, what to expect during the first year, those books were like kind of, on my bedside table all the time.
Mhm.
And here I had this kid who's not doing anything like that I expected, right? So it's
Mhm.
like, what not to expect. I just had this sort of idea that I wanted to write something about Millie. I didn't really get down to it until I moved to Santa Cruz and just happened to get a flyer for a workshop for parents of disabled kids for something called writing practice. Laura Davis, who's a teacher I've been working with for a long time, she's a student of Natalie Goldberg's. It's this sort of really kind of a little bit new agey, a little bit Buddhist, where you're given a prompt and you have 10 to 15 minutes to write. And then everyone in the group just reads what they wrote aloud. And the only thing you're allowed to say is, thank you, right? It's not any kind of critique. It's
Mhm.
simply about writing. And the rules are your pen shouldn't leave the paper. Most people do it pen and ink.
Mhm.
First thought, best thought, and be as vivid and concrete and specific as you can.
What a
So I
great
was writing
exercise.
just a bunch of sort of memoiristic stuff
Mhm.
at the same time as I was finding that Millie kept creeping into academic papers I was writing.
Mhm.
Like I was asked to write a paper, and it would be like, yeah, I want to think about politics through the lens of my daughter. It's like I
Mhm.
couldn't help but think about her as an example. So I ended up publishing some, essays for academics. So then, I ended up having a bunch of stuff. I'd finished another project. I got an NSF Scholars Award to do some studying with some wonderful psychologists at UCSC. I was really interested in language development. And then I took some courses at San Jose State in language development in infants and assistive and augmentative communication. I had this idea that I wanted to write a book about how it's possible to be social without using language or signs or conventions. Like this was just something that was interesting for me intellectually.
Mhm.
And so I had this idea I was going to like bring together all the memoir stuff and all the sort of nerdy academic stuff and mush it together and make it into a book. So as you can imagine, getting from there to the book as it exists, it took an understandably long time. I had to learn how to write this book and trying to write it. And one of the things that helped me is, I moved on from writing practice to a feedback class where people are definitely allowed to say things other than thank you. So it's like I went through all of the like anthropology-ish pieces that are in the middle of the book with all my classmates. And I'd be like, oh, this is so beautifully crafted, this passage. And they'd be like, boring. You have to completely change this. So yeah, there was a lot of rewriting. I had a lot of help from, friends. I looked into trying to do it as a trade press book, and I had friends who had done that who kind of helped me. And, it was really not at a stage where I could do that, but I got some really great, honest feedback. And then, submitted it to three different academic presses and got great feedback, great support from all of those presses, but ended up going with Duke University Press just because Ken Wissaker just was so helpful and committed, and they had the most rigorous process, and that's what I felt like the book really needed. But yeah, thanks for asking. I wish I had just like, oh, this is this is up to date. I'll just write it. I have been writing some pieces for the broader public that have been much more like, I got to get this out. As soon as I saw what was happening, it's like, this is a moment at which maybe I can kind of get my voice out there. And so I've been trying to do that quite hard, you know.
In the prologue, you say, this isn't a story about fitting in. It's a story about learning to fly. Can you talk about what that means?
Thank you so much. That's really a great question. Um, I think that kind of holds for, all three of us in the family in a way. Um, uh, there is a sense in which, and I've kind of talked about this already in a way, you have stories about your own life, you have stories about your children's life. I kind of came to anthropology after being a relatively high achieving but kind of awkward kid. you know, I grew up, I graduated from college in 1979. It seems like a really, joke and incredibly bad taste that I'm as old as I am, but I am, And so back in the day, and I went to a pretty working class high school, it's like, being a nerd was not at the top of the pecking order. I never really fitted in there. And then I got to college and I fit in better. And then I discovered anthropology. And this is kind of my thing. I really love the sort of commitment to moving into different, supposedly uncomfortable spaces. But I have to say, at various periods of my life, I was more comfortable living outside of the US than in it.
Mm,
So it's like I have this is my world, but this is a world where being a reader and a talker, and for me also an athlete, I've always been really athletic. My husband and I went on a burro packing trip in the Sierras for our honeymoon. I've always been quite outdoorsy. And I really had a sense that, we kind of fit into this world and my kids are going to fit in there too.
mm,
And that's kind of where we're going to go, right? And just having the sort of shock that, on the one hand, was Millie, but I think it was also Millie refracted through losing Craig, right?
mm,
Which, like I said, I think about him every day. I'm never going to get over it. At the same time, it really reprogrammed me in terms of like, I have to think hard about why I'm on this earth, right? And
mm,
one of the things that, I mean, a couple of things came to me. It's like suddenly all of these pathways into the future were closed. Like, I'm only here in the present. And what does it mean to be in the present? So that was one thing. I mean, the other thing was all of the people who came forward and supported me at that time, who are like part of my life, but I didn't really recognize, and I think often we don't recognize that those people that you have day-to-day interactions, the administrator in your academic department, your colleagues, the student who takes your class once and you never see them again, they're actually part of the infrastructure of your life and they
mhm,
should be dear to you, right? And
mhm,
that was really this feeling. People I'd only sat in a meeting with once called me on the day. And I'm like, okay, I would feel really cautious about doing that, but these people are
mhm,
willing to put themselves on the line to support me. And that was actually really kind of life changing for me. I joke about this. I remarried last summer finally, and my husband and I have a poodle. and we kind of laugh. It's like Susie is talking like poodles have packs. If you're in the pack, that's great. If you're the rest of the world, you get barked at. I wasn't really a barker, but I did have that. Craig is my pack.
mhm,
Ralph is my pack, my immediate family, but sort of recognizing that no, I'm really sustained by the world. And so, learning to fly, part of that is just learning to embrace these relationships that were critical to my life. It made me think about academia in a different way. It's kind of not an accident that I'm now really in a service administrative position. I no longer, it doesn't matter what I write anymore, which is
mhm,
incredibly freeing in terms of being an anthropologist. But
mhm,
then also for Millie's world, it's like, I've had so many remarkable people come into my life by way of Millie. And I've learned to see the world and the people who populate it and the things that populate it. She loves things. There are certain things she really loves. She loves sound. She loves music. She loves bird call. It's like all of those things have just become so much more vivid for me. So it's flying is kind of getting away from the road is a way. And I think that's the way I thought of that metaphor. And the other side of it is so many people helped me write this. And there's partners, Rose Skelton and Nomi Stone run something for ethnographic writers. They call it Field Studio. Rose Skelton's a very talented journalist and creative nonfiction writer, and Nomi's a poet, right? And so I
Mhm.
went to one of their workshops and they had us read samples of things. They were really into kind of the music of verse, right? And it
Mhm.
was by Helen McDonald and it was about birds. And like, for a reason, whatever, kind of random reasons, I became really obsessed with birds and just started reading all of her stuff. And then I started thinking about I wrote the thing about the monk parakeets for that workshop. And then, this sort of image of the flock, right? Where
Mhm.
flocks don't have directors, they're not really organized. Everyone's sort of adjusting themselves. Every bird is adjusting themselves to the bird next to them and sort of thinking about Millie's world as a kind of flock. It's not regimented. We don't know exactly what direction we're going, but we're going together. And that also is, I think, part of how flying comes out in the story.
Really beautiful. You argue, speaking of Millie's world, you
Yeah.
argue that language isn't an essential ingredient when it comes to making worlds. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, yeah, no, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that question. Um, I think part of what I'm saying here is that people like Millie have agency and power and an impact on other people that leads them to respond in ways that create ongoing relationships through time, right?
Mhm.
So, I begin with the story of Sarah McSweeney, the disabled 40, I think she's 42-year-old woman who died during COVID, and how medical professionals just judged her life as, in some sense, not worth saving, right? And
Mhm.
how all of her caregivers came forward. And it's like, no, this is someone who was a really important part of my life. And they described all the ways she operated in the world. And you can think about people are creating social routines around this particular woman who
Mhm.
didn't have language, right? In the sense that
Mhm.
we think of language. She did some things that were interpretable as yes or no, but she did not have, the ability to say, hey, I really like this shade of pink. Let's paint my nails like that. They
Mhm.
had to kind of figure it out. They had to pay really close attention to her. And I think that's always part of creating social worlds. I think what happens, and this is something psychologists write about, like stereotypes are pernicious in all sorts of ways, but they're also really useful. You don't have to go through the hard work of reasoning out what might be in someone's
Mhm.
head when you're
Mhm.
standing in the post office, line, not to like, stand in front of someone and talk to them if they don't want to talk to you. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which we have these little routines and they help us get through the day. But
Mhm.
I think at the heart of that is our ability to be responsive to one another and to be curious about one another without knowing what's going on in another person's head. Right. So,
Mhm.
Millie, I think, is really helpful for thinking about regular relationships too. Like how much of a conversation has to do with nothing like the meaning of words. It's how we're
Yeah.
sitting, it's the tone of our voice, it's the look on our face. And
Mhm.
if whenever you're in a relationship with someone, you have this all the time. It's like, they saw it. Are you mad at me? It's like, and then that
Yeah.
sets in motion like their reaction to you, which is like, was I mad? Now I'm mad. It's just like really, there's so much
Yeah.
that has to do with the mystery we all are to one another is actually a critical part of what it is to be social from the get-go for typical people too,
Yeah.
you know. So yeah, a kid looks where you're looking, and that sort of sets in motion a series of responses. right, and things become
Mhm.
predictable, and language works. I'm not saying it doesn't, but kind of at the base of this is a particular kind of leap of faith. That you can use. I mean, whatever, I draw on anthropology, I draw on philosophy, I
Mhm.
draw on a lot of different things in this book. I think this book is a little bit out there for an academic book, but I just feel like this is important to say,
Yeah.
right? Especially right now when like we're having a lot of trouble. We're getting led in the other direction of actually, first of all, recognizing that you don't know everything that's going on in another person's head. And secondly, exercising the muscles of imagination to be responsive to them and have a relationship with them nonetheless.
I love that exercising the muscles of imagination. You also say in the book, there are so many beautiful things that I highlighted. I just grabbed a few. The
Mm.
mystery Millie is to me has pulled me close to her. It has also made me wonder whether I have ever truly understood any of the people I've loved.
Yeah, that is great. Thank you so much
Mhm.
for drawing on that. I think that's really important. When you're like a teenager, or at least when I was a teenager,
Mhm.
you dream of true love, and true love is like someone you can bare your soul with. And you always think of being able to talk to that person and just let everything that's inside of you out, right?
Yeah.
And then you have a couple of relationships and you sort of realize that that's not necessarily what relationships are about, right? Like those
Mhm.
moments, it's kind of like, the Monica Lewinsky scandal
Mhm.
when Bill Clinton had to apologize again and again and again because it didn't seem sincere enough. There's no way of, like I said, there's not a CAT scan that can reveal your intentions, right? There's always this mediation through language, and there's always the possibility of misunderstanding. And, kind of what makes for intimacy in a relationship often has to do with a lot of things other than words, right? It's sort of developing an interpretation of the other person that kind of works, that allows you to be responsive to them in ways that keep them happy and comfortable and on their toes.
Mhm.
That's important in relationships too, you know? But the idea that the minute that you're in a relationship in which, or with your kids, where you're kind of like, I know exactly what this person is going to say,
Mhm.
or I know exactly what this person is thinking, that's kind of like, I don't want to say the beginning of the end, but those are kinds of moments that really, it's like problematic. No one likes to
Mhm.
be told that someone else knows exactly what they're thinking, and so I think disability is really good at bringing something that's just a more general aspect of parenting. And again, I talked about Andrew Solomon's book, and
Mhm.
I really love the way he looks at really different and in some cases quite, difficult situations, but then brings it back to like all of us, like how many of us want to live through our kids? How many of us have
Mhm.
that little unconscious idea that we're going to be immortal, that we are the same person when we're not? And that's really critical to parenting someone like my daughter. I think it sometimes can be forgotten, right? When people are working or, parenting someone like Millie, you
Mhm.
can, because you're treated like the expert, you can tell yourself you know what they want when maybe you
Mhm.
don't. And that's one of the beautiful things about Millie too, is she surprises me still. But that's also the most beautiful thing about all the people I love, is like they surprise me. You think you understand this person and suddenly they surprise you. And that, I think those surprises and working through that, like, oh, I think I know what you're saying. No, you don't. And figuring out, no, I was wrong. I think that's part of what keeps our relationships alive. So, yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up.
You've said that you write from two standpoints, that of a mother and that of a scholar. We've kind of talked about that.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you feel equally at home writing from each of those standpoints, or is the voice of the mother or the voice of the scholar, does one of those come through more clearly to you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about. It's ironic. My day job is giving away money to anthropologists. So I spend a lot of time working with reviewers and making decisions around like, is this, on some level, is this scholarly enough? You know? And I feel like I've always been kind of an unusual scholar. I came into anthropology because I wanted to go back and live in Indonesia with people. I'd enjoyed it for 2 years. I wanted to get back there, and Cornell had, scholars with important politics. So it's basically kind of random that I ended up there. And my entry into anthropology was, by way of philosophy, basically, and serious demand for deep historical knowledge of the colonial history and the context where I was working, right? And then I ended up at Chicago, which was kind of a powerhouse for training in anthropology. And then UCSC, where I was chair, and now I'm like president of this foundation. So I've always been a little bit of an unusual scholar in that, I'm kind of teaching myself because I think it's an ethical practice I've been bad at to really, pay heed to your debts to other scholars, to recognize that there are other people who are thinking about these problems, right? So that's one thing. That was one real improvement to the book. I don't know if that's evident to non-scholarly readers, but one of the readers that I had was like, you need to go back and really do your homework. And I did. And I think the
Mm,
things that I read over those months enriched the book enormously. I
mm,
think in terms of writing, I don't really want to write in a boring way ever again. you know, so and because I don't have to publish, to get paid anymore,
mm,
it's like yeah, so I'm actually really excited about this challenge of writing as both. And I think part of the question too is I always felt a little bit uncomfortable with the role mother, like
mm.
I was not, my husband loved toddlers. His mother did daycare in the home. And I was always like, kids are fun for about 15 minutes. Like give them back to the people who really know how to deal with them. But then when I had my own kids, like Ralph, it's like, oh my God, it was like this, angels on high. It's like it's your
Mhm.
own kid. It's just really different. But I was like, I'm not a mom, I'm Ralph's mom, in a sense.
Yes.
So writing as a mother, I guess, again, I think a lot of us are like that, I think
Mhm.
a lot of women and birthing people don't necessarily fit right into that category, or they have to tweak it to make it feel comfortable for them. And I was definitely one of those people. So yeah, writing as a mother is like about writing from the perspective of someone who was totally surprised at how much, and it's just a really stupid thing to say, but I was surprised at how much I love my children. It's like, I
It
really love
doesn't
my
sound
children. I
stupid.
still really love my children. It's like, when they were little, like Ralph was 5 months old, it's like, God, I feel sorry for all these people with 9-month-old babies because 5 months is the best age. And now Ralph is 28. It's like, I feel sorry for all you people with like 20-year-old kids because 28 is the best age, in the same way with Millie, so, but it's kind of, that's the woman who was like, I was only going to do this. And I was serious when I told Craig, you have to do half the work, and suddenly this is me. This is my life. How am I going to get through this? And so, yeah, the mother, the anthropologist. The other thing, when you're an anthropologist, you have this really obnoxious habit of filtering what's happening in your everyday life through your anthropological lenses. So, yeah, I think I wrote about that. I can't remember. It's like I got interviewed just randomly by the BBC. We were living in London when Ralph was born, on my way to Hammersmith High Street to like buy a baby monitor and a bunch of stuff, and they were like, "Oh, this statistic has just come out on the cost of raising children in London," and I went on about capitalism and how it feeds into people's fears and everything, and then I went off and bought the baby monitor. So there's always that kind of. It's not just like you sit down at your computer and you're an anthropologist. You sit down and you're a mother or you're another kind of writer. It's like you're kind of living these two things a lot of the time as an anthropologist. That's
Well,
whatever makes it fun. Yeah.
how do you think that your work as an anthropologist affects the way that you relate to Millie?
I think that it predisposed me to be curious about her and be
Mm,
interested,
mm,
and this connects to what I was talking about with like teaching. Like when she was in early intervention, on the one hand, part of my heart and soul was give me a job, I will work really hard and she will catch up, right? I was like,
mhm, mhm,
like I said, I'm an athlete. We're just going to train really hard and she'll catch up, you
mhm,
know. But then the other part of me was like, isn't it interesting how they're teaching me to act as if she's already communicating, even though I'm not sure she is? I just thought that
mhm,
was really interesting. So I think it helped me not just be like tragic about things, right? It
mhm,
helped me be interested. It also, I think, predisposes you to expect difference, right? Um,
mhm,
there's a wonderful, both new and older generation of disability anthropologists, Faye Ginsburg, whose quote, very generous quote you provided here,
mhm,
and someone who often co-writes with her, Raina Rapp, have published a book called Disability Worlds, and they're both they're parents, they have direct experience, and they've been doing work in this area for quite a long time and have just been incredibly welcoming to anthropologists who are interested in trying to think about this. And
mhm,
there's a lot of great writing on the irony that we're supposed to be about difference, but then we also have this really strong commitment, and it's an important one for political and ethical reasons to, kind of intellectual universality, right? There's
mhm,
a time when race scientists were arguing that people were different intellectually if they were different culturally or if they were different according to their versions of
mhm,
race, right? And that
mhm,
is so deeply problematic.
mhm,
But then at the same time, yeah, now we're realizing that people are actually neurodiverse in
mhm,
super interesting ways, and that
mhm,
different doesn't necessarily mean lesser
mhm,
or worse.
mhm,
There's also a new generation of disabled anthropologists who are bringing even more important insights into the field. So I think anthropology is the kind of discipline that opens itself to being kind of bold in the way we think about, you know, who's actually a social actor, who is a person in the world. So I think that really helped me, I think, as a mother. The fact I was able to be like, yeah, this is really rough in terms of what I thought my life was going to be, but it's also really interesting and I'd love to write about her. Yeah. Um, Yeah, I don't know. And there are also personality things too. I kind of have tended to treat everyone as if they're my age, whether they're 2 or 94, and I've been that way for a long time. And I think that really shaped my practice as a mother, for better or worse. I'm like not a disciplinarian at all. you know, Talked to my son not long ago, and about what he remembers about the past.
mhm.
He's read the book, and we've talked about it. He's like, suddenly in seventh grade, you were just telling me what to do. And it's like, what happened to my mom? So there's also that. Yeah.
Well, speaking of the writing side of things,
Yeah.
I'm also kind of interested in how your anthropologist side influences your creative writing.
Oh, that's really, really a great question. Um, yeah, I kind of, like I said, I'm a bit of a dinosaur. I've been around for a long time. The
Well,
first
you look
anthropologist,
great.
low light. um, No, I didn't read any anthropology in college. I double majored in biology and history, and I was interested in medieval social history. I only took one course about a place outside of like Europe during my entire time as an undergraduate. Um, but when I was in Java, living in Java, I read a book by Clifford Geertz called The Religion of Java. And, people maybe remember Geertz's writing, but he was a beautiful writer, right? He was an excellent writer. And I kind of, from an early age, I always wanted to be a writer. And so I think the fact I really like to write and the fact that anthropology, which I knew nothing about, seemed like you could do anything. Anything, it
Mhm.
seemed like the right kind of discipline for me. I think there is a way in which, as I've become more professionalized and kind of been in a world that's more professionalized, I think sometimes we're not doing as much concrete, vivid writing. We're not
Mhm.
telling stories in as engaging a way as we should. And I mean, I'm on a little bit of a mission with this. I think there are definitely exceptions, you know, but I think that there is a tendency, especially in first books, because people are writing scared. They're like, oh, what if I don't cite the right people? What if I don't
Mhm.
sound smart enough? You have these really long introductions that just slog on and on.
Mhm.
And then you actually get to the interesting stuff, and like the ethnographic stuff is given short strip. We don't really get to know the people. We don't really
Mhm.
place ourselves in these locations. And something that we've been working on at Wennergren, is precisely writing. Like we need to reach broader audiences if we're going to survive as a discipline. If you just look around at, right wing, officials and politicians when they're talking about like what's wasteful in universities, it's like
Mhm.
anthropology majors are often at the top of the list. Um, but the other side is like we tend to be really committed to the people who we work with in doing our research, and we need to do justice to them, which means we need to tell their stories in ways that don't just move forward thinking within our field, which is totally a valuable thing to be doing, but also is in some sense recognizable to the people we work with and is going to actually kind of make a difference potentially in their lives. I mean, I think there are two examples of books that I think are really beautiful and super important right now. And one is by an anthropology PhD who's become a journalist. It's called
Mhm.
There's No Place for Us Here, Working and Homeless in the United States. And it's a beautiful study of, I think, like five families. And it brings in all of the complex contextual factors that we study as anthropologists, but it also brings these people's lives to light, right? And to life. And he's been getting a lot of attention for this book, and it's so important. It's important to me because some of those families are like people who work as care workers. They're paid so little in our society, they can't afford to have a permanent place to live. So there's that book. Another book that's come out that does that kind of crossover work is a book by Anand Pandian
Mhm.
called Something Between Us. And
Mhm.
it's like he was about to set out on a project about the bottled water industry. He's an environmental anthropologist, but then Trump got elected and he just found himself like, how did this happen? Right. And he's the son of Indian immigrants. And he's like, actually, I don't just want to do bottled water. I just want to travel around the world and have conversations with people on the other side of the political divide. And
Mhm.
he kind of did that. And he wrote this book
Mhm.
that's like he goes to a white supremacist, rally. He, interviews someone who's an executive of a like home hardening,
Mhm.
enterprise. He reflects on SUVs as like rolling fortresses. He talks about all the way we create walls that divide us from one
Mhm.
another as a
Mhm.
society. He talks about social media. He does have a wonderful chapter on the bottled water industry, which is extremely funny. Um, but anyway, he tells these stories and he's making really important anthropological points, but he's doing it in this really story forward way. And he's also showing what it's like to be an anthropologist. This is like a scholar of color going to a white supremacist rally and following the journalists who go and hang out with the white supremacists. It's like he's actually kind of, putting himself on the line in a way that I think many anthropologists do, but don't kind of bring that to life for readers. So I feel
Mhm.
like there's a lot of room within our academic writing as well as our crossover writing to do that kind of work. We talk about reaching
Mhm.
broader publics. It's like our broadest public are the undergraduates who take our courses. And so if we could start reaching them with our writing, I think that would really make a difference for the discipline and maybe even the world. So,
Are
yeah.
you planning more crossover writing?
Yeah, Yeah, I'm just, there's part of me that wants to go back to my Popwin material and do something that's kind of a little nerdy. I feel very committed to the people I knew there. They're still part of my life, I'm,
Mhm.
helping people out financially, and I don't get there often because of just with Millie, it's been hard, but I'm hoping to go back before long. But I've also just been thinking about whatever, something I'm curious about. And my husband, who's a fiction writer, but also a really good jazz guitarist and one of the sweetest humans in the world. He's a great person. But one of the people he likes, one of the things he likes doing with Millie is playing like blues riffs on his electric guitar. And she just loves it. She loves music. So I've been thinking about that issue, like disability music, but also
Mm,
time. Like in the book, I say, for Millie, there's only the now. That's not really true. There is this sensitivity to intervals, right? And the pleasure of expectations that are
mm,
either met or not. So thinking about music and disabled people, and a lot of people like Millie are really into music. So I want to kind of do something around that, but at the same time, like I said, I feel like it's a sick joke that I'm as old as I am. But one of the things I'm finding really curious is what happens to your experience of intervals of time, right? The weird things that start happening to time
mhm,
as you get older, both like the days that flash by in a second, you
mhm,
know, the things that happened years ago that feel like they're yesterday. Like, what is that
mhm,
kind of experience of time? And a lot of anthropologists, and this is like I'd have to do a lot of homework, they've written about aging, they've written about experience of time. It's like a great topic in literature, it's a great topic
mhm.
in philosophy. It would give me a chance to do a lot of reading. And it would also give me a chance to write about someone else where I just touch upon in the book, which is my mother, who had an extremely creative form of dementia before she died, in which she wrote poetry, and she had this incredibly active fantasy life with imaginary boyfriends. And she was kind of living in this really different time. So that kind of thing of like
Oh,
temporality, being in time as different kinds of, people with different kinds of mind body experiences. This is just a really rough idea, but it just
I'm
feels like
loving
it could
it.
be really fun to write about because everyone, it's like I could just talk to all my friends. It's like, yeah, damn,
Yeah.
where did it go? you know, right?
Yeah, I'm listening to this and I'm like, yeah, I need to read this.
exactly. Yeah.
What do you hope that readers take away from your current book, from Beautiful Mystery?
Oh, thank you so much for that. I hope they understand the chapters in the middle, you know, because I worked hard and it was a heavy lift. I hope they understand some of the nerdier things. I mean, that is always everyone's dream. It's like communicate your nerdy things to broader audiences. So I do hope that. I hope that they examine some of their assumptions
Mm,
about disabled people. There's a tendency when your kid is little, everyone's like, oh, she's so cute. And they come up and talk to you. But as your kid gets older, like people who are not
mhm,
already part of these worlds, they just don't look at her, right? Or if they interact with her, they just try to be really normal and then they're just like talking over her head. So I hope that people will come away from this book with a lot more curiosity,
mm,
right? And a
mhm.
lot kind of examine some of the fear that we have around this kind of difference. Um, people have been telling me it's a tearjerker, and it's just like I said, my husband is a professional fiction writer, and he's like, sentimentality is like totally the worst thing in the world. So I'm like a little bit like, oh, everyone's gonna think it's so touching. It's like I don't really like the word touching. I more like just want to bring to life this, life that's actually incredibly joyful. I think Millie and
Mm,
I both have a great life. I am happy as a clam. Things have worked out wonderfully for me. I will miss my husband forever, you
mm,
know, but like being a human, whatever the Buddhists say, it's suffering, right? But it's
mhm.
also like that's part of the beauty of life. So I hope that people want to come away from this thinking this is just a really sad story and I'm like some heroine who's survived sadness. It's like, no, this is about a really lucky person who learned to think about the world she's in a different kind of way.
I love that. We have a traditional last question on the podcast, and it is, when beautiful mystery is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
So, Kelley, I did do my homework and I listened to a few, and I'm like, I have no idea. But then I think it's got to be a blues riff. You know, something by Muddy Waters, maybe. You
Nice.
know, right? Yeah, no, that's just like such a nasty question.
A
Yeah.
blues riff. There we go.
Okay. Great.
Danilyn Rutherford, thank you so, so much for being here. It has been such a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. And like I said, I'm extremely honored that you read my book and you chose me to come on. So thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.